Dr. Evelyn Carter had seen many unusual cases in her 10 years as a psychiatrist, but nothing quite like the man sitting in front of her. He was in his early 30s with sharp blue eyes and dark, unkempt hair. He had been admitted to St. Mary's Hospital 3 days ago after being found wandering the streets in a daze. No identification, no memory, no words. The nurses had named him John Doe. Evelyn studied him carefully, hoping for any sign of recognition in his eyes. He simply stared at her, expressionless. "Do you remember anything?" she asked softly. John didn't respond. He didn't nod, didn't shake his head. Nothing. It was as if he was trapped in a world of silence. Evelyn glanced at his medical reports. Physically, he was fine. No injuries, no signs of trauma. And yet, he refused to speak. "Okay," she continued, keeping her voice gentle. "Let's try something different. Can you write your name?" She handed him a notepad and pen. John hesitated, then took them. For a brief moment, hope flickered in Evelyn's chest. But then he simply drew a single symbol on the paper. A circle with a line through it. Evelyn frowned. "What does this mean?" John's gaze met hers for the first time, and for a split second, she saw something behind his eyes. Fear. A shiver ran down her spine. Something was very wrong. Dr. Evelyn Carter stared at the symbol on the paper, a simple circle with a line through it. It was familiar, but she couldn't quite place it. She looked up at John, who was now gripping the pen tightly, his knuckles turning white. His breathing had quickened slightly. "It's okay," she said gently. "You're safe here." John didn't react. He simply dropped the pen and turned his gaze to the window, as if something outside was far more important than anything happening in the room. Evelyn sighed and leaned back in her chair. She had dealt with trauma patients before, some who had lost their memories, others who had chosen to forget. But John felt different. He wasn't just lost. He was hiding. From what? She decided to try another approach. "What about sounds?" she asked, reaching for her phone. "Maybe music or voices could help." She scrolled through a playlist and played an old jazz tune. It was slow and calming, the kind of music that usually soothed anxious patients. But as soon as the melody filled the room, John's entire body tensed. His fingers curled into fists, and for the first time, real panic flashed across his face. Then, just as suddenly, he shoved his chair back and stood up. "John." Evelyn stood too, raising her hands to calm him. His breathing was ragged now, and his eyes darted around the room. Then, in a hoarse, broken voice, he whispered his first word since arriving at the hospital. "They're coming." Evelyn's stomach tightened. "Who's coming, John?" He didn't answer. Instead, he did something that made her blood run cold. He took the notepad, flipped to a fresh page, and began writing. This time, not a symbol, but a list of names. The first name was hers. Dr. Evelyn Carter's breath caught in her throat as she read the first name on the list. Evelyn Carter, her own name, written in shaky but deliberate handwriting. Beneath it, John continued writing, his hand moving faster now. Daniel Reeves, Margaret Holloway, Samuel Kent. The names meant nothing to her, but the way John's grip tightened around the pen, the urgency in his eyes, it sent a chill through her. "John," she said carefully, "who are these people?" He paused, staring at the paper as if debating whether to say more. Then he looked at her, his expression filled with something she could only describe as dread. "They're next," he whispered. Evelyn felt a slow, creeping unease settle into her chest. Next for what? John's hands trembled as he set the pen down. His gaze flickered to the window again, scanning the outside world as if expecting someone, or something, someone to appear. "You have to leave," he said, his voice barely audible. "They know you're here." Evelyn swallowed hard. "Who knows?" John didn't answer. Instead, he gripped his own arms, shaking his head as if trying to shake off a memory too terrible to relive. Evelyn knew she had to tread carefully. If John was suffering from extreme paranoia or delusions, pushing him too hard could make things worse. But if there was even a shred of truth to what he was saying... She glanced down at the names again. Maybe she could verify them. Maybe they were real people. For the first time since meeting John Doe, Evelyn felt something stir inside her. Not just professional curiosity, but fear. "John," she said slowly, "am I in danger?" He looked at her, his eyes dark and serious. Then finally he gave a single, slow nod. And in that moment, the lights in the room flickered. The overhead lights flickered once, twice, then plunged the room into momentary darkness. Evelyn's heart pounded as she reached for her phone, its glow casting eerie shadows on the walls. Across the table, John remained frozen, his breathing shallow. Then, the lights snapped back on. Evelyn exhaled, forcing herself to stay calm. "It's just a power issue. Hospitals have these all the time." But deep down, she knew this was different. She looked at John. His face was pale, his fingers gripping the edges of the table so hard they turned white. "They're here," he whispered. A chill crept down her spine. "John, who's here?" He didn't answer. Instead, he did something that terrified her more than his silence. He grabbed her wrist. "Please," he said, his voice shaking. "We have to go. Now." Evelyn hesitated. This wasn't normal paranoia. This was something else, something primal. The way he held on to her, the raw fear in his eyes, it wasn't an act. Then, before she could respond, a sharp knock echoed from the door. Evelyn turned, her pulse racing. "Dr. Carter?" a voice called from outside. It was Nurse Patel, one of the night staff. "Are you okay? The power outage messed with some of the security doors." Evelyn let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. "I'm fine," she called back. "Just a flicker, I think." She turned back to John, but he was already shaking his head. "It wasn't the power," he said. "It was them." Evelyn glanced toward the door, then back at John. "Who are they?" John swallowed hard. "They take people. They erase them." He pointed at the list of names. "They were here before, and now they're coming back for you." Evelyn opened her mouth to respond, but then the knocking started again. Only this time, it wasn't from the door. It was coming from the window. The knocking at the window was slow, deliberate. Evelyn's breath caught in her throat. They were on the 4th floor. There shouldn't be anyone outside that window. John's grip on her wrist tightened. "Don't move," he whispered. Evelyn forced herself to turn, her stomach twisting with dread. The window blinds were partially closed, but through the gaps, she could make out a faint silhouette. A figure stood outside, pressed against the glass. No harness, no ledge. Nothing holding them up. The knocking came again. 3 steady taps, then silence. Evelyn's pulse pounded in her ears. She reached for her phone with her free hand, fingers trembling as she unlocked the screen. She needed security, needed someone to explain what she was seeing. But before she could make a call, John snatched the phone away. "Don't," he hissed. Evelyn turned to him, shock flashing through her. "John, I need to..." "They're listening," he whispered. His eyes darted back to the window, his entire body tense. "If you call someone, they'll know we're awake. We have to act like we don't see them." The words sent a cold shiver down Evelyn's spine. She glanced at the window again. The figure was still there. Watching. Then in a slow, unnatural motion, its head tilted. A horrible realization hit Evelyn all at once. There was no face. Just smooth, pale skin where eyes, a nose, and a mouth should have been. She clamped a hand over her mouth to stop the scream rising in her throat. The figure raised one hand and pressed it flat against the glass. A single symbol was drawn across its palm. A circle with a line through it. The same symbol John had drawn. Evelyn's mind raced. What the hell was happening? John was already moving. He yanked her toward the door, his grip iron tight. "We have to go," he said urgently. The lights flickered again. The air in the room felt heavier, charged with something wrong. Then the window creaked. as if something was trying to open it. Evelyn didn't hesitate. She grabbed the list of names and ran. Evelyn ran. She didn't question it, didn't stop to rationalize, just ran. John was right behind her, his breathing ragged. As they bolted down the hospital corridor, the lights above them flickered again, casting jagged shadows along the walls. Evelyn's mind raced. What had she just seen? That thing at the window? It wasn't possible. It shouldn't be possible. But she had seen it, and worse, it had seen her. John grabbed her arm, steering her toward the stairwell. "Elevators aren't safe," he muttered. "They'll trap us inside." Evelyn didn't argue. They burst through the stairwell doors, the heavy metal clanging behind them. John took the steps 2 at a time, but Evelyn hesitated. "Wait!" she gasped, still clutching the list of names. "We need to warn security." John turned, his expression stricken. "You don't get it. They are security. Or they were." His voice dropped lower. "They take people, Evelyn. They don't leave bodies, no reports, no missing person cases, just gone, like they never existed." Evelyn shook her head, her logical mind fighting against what she was hearing. "That doesn't make sense." John let out a bitter laugh. "Yeah? Then why can't you remember the people on that list?" Evelyn froze. Daniel Reeves, Margaret Holloway, Samuel Kent. She had looked at those names, read them aloud, but now, as she tried to picture their faces, there was nothing. A hollow void where memories should have been. John saw the realization dawn on her. "You feel it, don't you? They were here. You might have passed them in the halls, spoken to them, but they're already fading. That's what they do." He tapped his temple. "Erase you, piece by piece." Evelyn's hands trembled. This was insane. Impossible. And yet she had studied memory disorders for years. She knew how the brain worked. And this? This wasn't normal forgetfulness. It was something else, something worse. A loud bang echoed from above. Both of them turned. Footsteps, slow, measured, deliberate, descending the stairs from the top floor. Not hurried, not searching, hunting. John grabbed her hand. "We have to keep moving." Evelyn didn't hesitate this time. They sprinted downward, taking turns so fast she nearly slipped. Then, just as they reached the second floor, the stairwell lights went out completely. Pitch black. The footsteps didn't stop. They were getting closer. The darkness was suffocating. Evelyn pressed her back against the cold stairwell wall, her breaths shallow. The only sound was the slow, deliberate footsteps descending toward them. John gripped her wrist tightly. She could feel his pulse, rapid, panicked. "They can't see well in the dark," he whispered, barely audible. "But they can hear. Don't move." Evelyn clenched her jaw, trying to steady her breathing. She could feel something. A presence. Looming just above them, close enough to touch. Then the air shifted. A soft, unnatural whisper drifted through the darkness. It wasn't words, not exactly, but a sound. Low, distorted, like static over a radio. John tensed beside her. Evelyn felt his fingers tighten around hers. Then, a new sound. Sniffing. The thing in the dark was smelling the air. Searching. Evelyn felt a cold sweat break out on the back of her neck. If it could track them by scent, they were already dead. Her mind raced. Think. The paper. Her grip on the list of names tightened. It was the only thing they had, the only connection between her. John, and whatever was happening. Maybe it was a link. Carefully, she lifted the paper to her lips and tore off a small piece with her teeth. John stiffened, confused. She pressed the tiny scrap into his palm and mimed the motion. "Eat it." John's eyes widened, but after a split second, he obeyed. Evelyn swallowed her piece. The paper was dry, tasteless, but she forced it down. It wasn't much, but if these things erased people, erased memories, maybe having the names inside them would make them harder to erase. The sniffing stopped. A long, unnatural silence filled the stairwell. Then movement. The thing shifted away, its footsteps retreating. Evelyn's stomach twisted. Did it work, or were they just lucky? She wasn't about to wait and find out. John tugged her arm. Go, now. They moved carefully, step by step, until they reached the door to the second floor. Evelyn gripped the handle, held her breath, then pushed. It swung open, revealing a dimly lit hospital hallway. They stepped inside, closing the door behind them. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then, John exhaled a shaky breath. That was too close. Evelyn nodded, her mind still spinning. We need to figure out what's happening. Who's behind this? She held up the half-eaten paper. And why they don't want us to remember. John swallowed hard. If we dig too deep, a loud scream cut through the hospital halls. It wasn't human. It was Mom something else. The scream echoed through the hallway, a jagged, unearthly sound that vibrated the walls. It wasn't a cry for help, it was a warning. Evelyn's blood ran cold. What was that? She whispered, her voice trembling. John's face had drained of color, his eyes wide with fear. They found us, he said hoarsely. It's too late. Evelyn's heart pounded. They couldn't afford to stop now. She glanced down the hallway. The distant echo of footsteps grew louder. Someone, or something, was coming. Run! John hissed, grabbing her arm again. They sprinted through the empty halls, avoiding the few stray lights that still flickered overhead. The building felt different now. Cold, silent, and alive, in a way that made Evelyn feel like they were being watched from every corner. The scream came again, louder this time, but this time it was closer, much closer. Evelyn's thoughts raced. What happened to the world she knew? This wasn't just some strange paranoia. There was something incredibly wrong with this place, something darker than she could have ever imagined. Where are we going? She gasped, struggling to keep up with John. I know a place, he said, his voice tight. A safe room. It's not much, but it's all we've got. They reached an old door at the end of a narrow hallway, the hinges creaking as John threw it open. Inside, it was cold, darker than the rest of the hospital, but it was silent, a perfect hiding spot. Evelyn stepped in, but just as she closed the door behind her, she caught sight of something that froze her in place. A shadow lingering at the end of the hall. No body, just a dark mass, formless and shifting like smoke. John's eyes followed her gaze. It's them. His voice was low, almost reverent. They can't come in here, not yet. The shadow slowly began to move, but it never crossed the threshold. It hovered, waiting, watching. Evelyn's hands shook. She couldn't understand. How was this possible? What were they? What was happening to the world outside? But there were more immediate questions now. How did John know about this? And why had he been so insistent on keeping her from remembering? She turned to face him, her voice trembling. John, what's going on? Why didn't you tell me everything? He didn't answer right away. His eyes flickered between the shadow and Evelyn. Then he sighed deeply, walking over to the corner where an old desk sat. He slumped into the chair and leaned forward, hands covering his face. It's too dangerous to explain all at once, he muttered, but I'll try. Evelyn stepped closer, her heart racing. Tell me, now! John looked up, his eyes hollow with exhaustion. The names on that list? They're people like you, people who can see them, who remember too much. The rest, the ones who forget, they're erased. Evelyn blinked in confusion. Erased? Like, what, deleted from existence? John nodded. In a way, they leave no trace, no record. The memories fade, but it's not just your memory. It's your life, as if you were never born. He took a shuddering breath. And the ones who remember? They're hunted. They don't last long. Evelyn's mind struggled to process what he was saying, but before she could speak, Another scream filled the air, closer this time, more urgent. The shadow outside was moving again. Evelyn's voice barely escaped. "We need to go. We need to get out of here." John shook his head. "There's no escape, Evelyn. They won't stop coming. We're already in the system, and they know we're here." As the shadow reached the door, Evelyn felt the temperature drop suddenly. It was colder in the room now, a chilling presence enveloping them. She turned to John, her eyes wide with panic. "We can't just stay here," she shouted. But John's expression softened for a moment. "I'm sorry. I was hoping it wouldn't come to this. But now, you need to remember. You need to understand what you're dealing with." And with that, the door burst open. The door slammed open with a force that rattled the walls. The shadow outside poured into the room like smoke, swirling and twisting, its presence so overwhelming that Evelyn felt the air press against her chest. John leaped to his feet, his eyes wide with terror. "They're here. We can't hide anymore." The shadow didn't move like a living thing. It was fluid, shifting between spaces, barely there, yet completely suffocating. It was as if it didn't need a body to exist, just a will to consume. John pulled Evelyn toward the back of the room, but the shadow was faster. It lunged forward, tendrils of darkness reaching out, brushing against their skin. Evelyn felt her heart skip a beat as the cold touched her. It was as if the darkness was sucking the warmth from her body. "Evelyn!" John's voice cracked with panic. "We have to run! Now!" Before they could make it to the door, the shadow stopped. The air froze. The whispering static from before filled the room once again, louder, more frantic. Evelyn turned slowly, fear clawing at her throat. It was waiting. The shadow's form began to solidify, and for the first time, Evelyn saw something that resembled a face twisted and blank, like an abstract mask made of darkness. Its eyes were hollow, pits of emptiness that seemed to stare directly into her soul. "You can't run from me," a voice echoed. It wasn't a voice she could understand, but it resonated in her mind, a deep, dark hum that made her bones ache. "You'll forget, all of you, and when you do, we will take you." John's grip on her arm tightened, his voice a whisper of desperation. "They're not real, not in the way we are. They can't die. They can't be stopped." The shadow's form wavered and then split apart. Dozens of tendrils shot forward, wrapping around John's legs and pulling him to the floor. His scream was swallowed by the darkness, and Evelyn was paralyzed, watching in horror as the shadow began to pull him into its depths. "No!" she screamed, reaching for him, but the tendrils wrapped tighter around her too, dragging her toward the black mass. She fought with every ounce of strength, but it was no use. The darkness was too strong. It overwhelmed her senses, pulling her into its cold embrace. Then a bright flash of light. Suddenly everything stopped. The tendrils loosened. The air grew warm again. The darkness flickered as if it were losing its hold. Evelyn gasped for breath, scrambling to her feet. John was lying on the floor, unconscious but alive. She pulled him up as best she could, her mind racing. The shadow was retreating. But why? "Get out!" a voice rang out, not from the shadow but from somewhere deep inside her. It was the same voice she had heard in the hallway when she first looked at the list of names. The voice that felt so familiar yet out of reach. "You still have time." Evelyn's mind snapped back to reality. She had to leave, now. He shook John awake. "John, we need to move. They're coming back." He stirred, groaning, but didn't speak. Evelyn didn't wait for him. She grabbed his arm and pulled him toward the door. They stumbled into the hall, running without looking back. Behind them, the shadow was slowly reforming. It wasn't finished yet, but Evelyn knew this. They couldn't stay here anymore. They had to find answers, and they had to find them fast. Evelyn and John ran through the narrow hospital corridors, the flickering lights casting jagged shadows that seemed to chase them at every turn. John was stumbling, barely conscious, but he managed to keep his feet beneath him as they pushed forward, their breaths ragged in the silence. Evelyn's mind was a whirl of confusion. What had happened back there? The shadow, the face that wasn't a face, and that voice that had spoken to her, urging her to leave. It all felt like something out of a nightmare, yet she knew it was far too real. "John," she gasped, pulling him into a supply closet. They were both out of breath, and she could see him swaying on his feet, barely holding on. "What was that? What are we dealing with?" John's face was pale, his lips dry. He leaned against the wall, his eyes unfocused. It's not just a creature, not like anything you've seen. They're oblivion." His voice trembled. "They erase what they touch. Everything. Every memory, every life, every person who knows too much. The list, those names, it's not just a record, it's a warning." Evelyn's heart skipped a beat. "A warning? From who?" John closed his eyes, shaking his head. "The people who tried to stop them, they're the ones who created the list. But even they couldn't stop it. No one can." The door to the supply closet creaked, and Evelyn froze. She slowly turned her head toward it, her body stiffening. The shadows in the hallway moved, twisting unnaturally. "They've found us," John whispered, his voice barely audible. "They always find us." Before she could respond, the door burst open, and the darkness poured in. Not the shadow from before, but something worse. Something tangible. Evelyn and John scrambled backward as the air in the room grew suffocatingly heavy. The floor beneath them seemed to warp, the walls stretching and bending in ways that didn't make sense. The darkness was pulling the very fabric of reality apart. "Go!" John screamed, shoving her toward the back exit. "They're going to erase everything, Evelyn. Everything." Evelyn didn't question him. She bolted for the door, her heart pounding in her chest. Behind her, she could hear John's footsteps, but they were fading fast, like the sound of someone running through a tunnel. She pushed through the door, the cool night air rushing into her lungs as she stumbled into the back alley of the hospital. For a moment, everything was still. The city lights flickered in the distance, and the quiet hum of the streets felt like a dream. Then the ground trembled beneath her feet. The shadow was still chasing them. It wasn't content with just the hospital. It was spreading out, expanding. "John!" Evelyn called, spinning in a circle, but there was no sign of him. The darkness seemed to press in on all sides, the air growing colder by the second. She had no idea where to go, no plan. Then a whisper. Evelyn froze. The voice, soft and indistinct, came from behind her. "Leave the list." Her eyes widened. That voice. The same voice that had guided her. That had told her to remember. To remember what? Evelyn turned to find a figure standing in the alleyway. A tall, thin figure wearing a long coat, their face hidden in shadow. But there was something familiar about the silhouette. "I'm not leaving until I understand what's happening," she said, her voice firm. "I don't care what this is, I need answers." The figure stepped forward, slowly pulling back its hood. Evelyn gasped. It was herself. Her face, but different, older. There were lines beneath the eyes, dark circles. This version of her seemed worn, tired, as if she had lived 100 lives. But it was her. "Evelyn," the figure spoke, her voice a tired echo of her own. "You can't keep running. The more you fight them, the harder it will be to remember who you were." "Who are you?" Evelyn asked, her voice trembling. The figure reached out, placing a hand on her shoulder. "I'm what's left of you. I'm what you're going to become. If you survive this, if you survive." The shadows behind them moved again. Evelyn could hear the low hum of something approaching, something far worse than the last. Evelyn's heart raced as she stared at the older version of herself. The woman he seemed to radiate a kind of quiet resignation, as if she had accepted what was happening, what was inevitable. "Survive what?" Evelyn asked, her voice a whisper. The words felt heavy, as though the air itself was thick with secrets too dangerous to be spoken aloud. The older Evelyn's eyes softened, filled with something like sorrow, or perhaps pity. Surviving them, surviving oblivion. She glanced around nervously, as though expecting the darkness to swallow her whole any second. "You'll understand soon. But right now, you have to remember. Everything. The list, the faces, the names, they're connected. It's all part of a plan. But it's not what you think. Evelyn's mind spun. I don't understand. What plan? Who are they? The woman in front of her sighed, her shoulders slumping slightly. I can't explain it all yet. Not here. Not while they're watching. But I will help you. I promise. Before Evelyn could respond, the ground beneath them trembled again, more violently this time. The shadows closed in, stretching out like a vast, insatiable creature. The air was growing colder by the second, and the low hum grew louder, vibrating through her chest. Run! The older Evelyn urged, grabbing her hand. Run now! Evelyn hesitated, but the urgency in the woman's eyes, her eyes pushed her forward. The alleyway ahead of them seemed to twist and contort as the shadows spread out in every direction, wrapping around everything in their path. They ran, the sound of their footsteps muffled by the creeping darkness. Evelyn's thoughts were a blur, but the image of her older self herself kept replaying in her mind. What did she mean? Was she really her, or was it just another trick of the shadows? They turned a corner, and the world seemed to shift once more. The alley that had been behind the hospital was now gone, replaced by a vast, desolate landscape. It was barren and empty, the sky overhead a sickly shade of gray, as though even the clouds were afraid to exist here. Evelyn's heart sank. The world itself felt wrong, like a dream she couldn't wake up from. The shadows weren't just following her now, they were part of the world. And in the distance she saw them, figures, tall, thin, and cloaked in darkness. The shapes moved without sound, their faces hidden beneath hoods that were impossible to decipher, but Evelyn felt their presence knew them. They're coming, the older Evelyn whispered, her voice shaking. This is what happens when you try to escape them. They follow you, tear everything apart. You can't outrun them. You have to face them. You have to remember why they're chasing you. Evelyn felt a cold knot tighten in her stomach. Why? She asked, almost afraid to hear the answer. Because, the woman whispered, stepping closer, they'll take everything, everyone you love, your past, your future, everything you've ever known. All for a reason you can't even comprehend yet. But if you stop fighting them now, if you stop running, you might save what's left of yourself. The darkness closed in again, faster now, its presence almost tangible. Evelyn could feel it pressing on her chest, smothering her, stealing the air from her lungs. She turned, her eyes darting desperately around, but there was nowhere to run. The figures in the distance were nearly upon them, their silhouettes growing sharper, more defined. And then, the older Evelyn reached into her coat and pulled out a small leather-bound notebook. It was the poi list. Take it, she said softly, holding the book out. You need to carry it. The list is the key. Evelyn stared at the book, feeling the weight of it in the older Evelyn's hands. It was old, its edges worn and frayed, as if it had been passed through countless hands before hers. She knew without a doubt that it was important, but was it a curse or a salvation? Evelyn took the book. The moment her fingers brushed against its cover, a pulse of energy surged through her, as though something deep inside her had been awakened. It was as if the answers she sought were hiding just beneath the surface, waiting to be unlocked. Remember, the older Evelyn repeated, her voice trembling. It's all connected. The names, the faces, the things you've forgotten. Don't let them erase you. Don't let them erase me. The figures were almost upon them now. The darkness, relentless, swept through the air like a tidal wave. Evelyn looked at the book in her hands, and in that instant, she knew. She had no choice but to remember. The shadows were coming, but she would not let them take her. The darkness closed in on Evelyn, pressing on her chest with a suffocating weight. She clutched the book in her hands, feeling its pulse under her fingers, the energy growing stronger with every beat of her heart. It was as if the list itself was alive, vibrating with secrets, with memories that were hers, but not hers. The answers were so close, yet just beyond her reach. The figures were upon them now, surrounding her. They moved in silence, their cloaks billowing like shadows in the windless air. Evelyn felt their eyes on her, though their faces remained hidden. They were the embodiment of oblivion of everything that had been erased, everything that had been forgotten. "Evelyn," the older version of herself whispered, her voice a quiet tremor. "You have to remember. You can stop them, but only if you understand the truth." Evelyn's eyes flew open wide, the weight of the truth suddenly crashing down on her. She remembered. It was like a floodgate opening, memories flooding her mind all at once. The faces, the names, the events, all connected, all part of something bigger than she could have imagined. She saw the faces of the people on the list. They weren't just victims. They were the creators, the ones who had tried to fight back. They had written the list, not to warn the world, but to give it a chance. To give someone, her, a chance to stop it. She saw the face of the shadow, the creature that had been chasing her. It wasn't a monster. It was a reflection of herself, a twisted version of the person she had become. And then she understood. The shadows, the oblivion, they weren't after her because of what she knew. They were after her because she was the key. The list, the names, it was not just a record, it was a map. The map to her salvation, the map to stopping the cycle. Evelyn took a deep breath. Her older self's words echoed in her mind. "You can't keep running." It was time to face them. "Stop!" she shouted, her voice cutting through the heavy air. The figures surrounding her paused, their dark shapes shifting, warping in the space between time. "Evelyn." The shadowed figure at the front spoke, its voice deep and hollow, like a voice from the abyss. "You cannot escape. The cycle must continue." Evelyn stepped forward, the weight of the list in her hands like an anchor pulling her to the ground. "I don't have to escape," she said, her voice steady, strong. "I'm going to end it." The air around her began to hum, the ground trembling beneath her feet. The shadows recoiled as though sensing her resolve. The darkness that had consumed the world around her began to retreat, inch by inch. The figures shrank back, their forms flickering like fading stars. "Evelyn," the older Evelyn whispered, her form flickering with the darkness. "It's not over. There's still a choice." The figures around her hesitated. Then, as if something inside them shifted, they stepped back into the shadows. The ground beneath Evelyn's feet settled, the weight of the book in her hands no longer pulling her down, but lifting her up. "Remember who you are," the older Evelyn's voice echoed one last time. "Remember what you were meant to be." And then, everything was silent. Evelyn stood alone, the shadows gone, the world no longer twisted and broken. The air was clear, the night sky visible above, the distant hum of the city streets returning to a familiar rhythm. She looked down at the list in her hands. The names, the faces. She knew them all now. She understood them. She had remembered. It wasn't just the list that had been erased. It was the very essence of what they were, what they had fought for. She had rewritten it. The cycle had been broken. The shadows had lost. And for the first time in what felt like forever, Evelyn was free. She looked at the book in her hands, the weight of it no longer a burden but a part of her. The truth had been revealed. The shadows had been defeated. But in their place, she felt something new, something powerful. She had become not just a survivor, but a guardian. The list would be remembered. She would be remembered. And as she walked away from the alley, into the quiet city, the last remnants of the darkness faded into the night.